Oh, it's
We
it's
have
not,
too many
it's not,
people to ride the bus.
I think it was mistaken, yeah. So it's marketing. That's
The
what
dance
so it seemed like it.
For some people like Ryan and Angie.
I appreciate the thought.
So
So, oh yeah, yeah. I think it was I think there was some
contacted me to see if she
sort of video. Probably from the party that there was a show. But it was nice anyway. It was nice yeah, it's alright. I appreciate it. That's nice. I've heard things about you. I want you to be conflicted there. Yeah. I know. Well, maybe you can get him this year. That might be. Oh my goodness. Surely not. Well, thank you.
Test 1 2. Test 1 2. Yeah, good.
No. yes and no. We have spring football right now, and they have sort of now we're having practice on this week. We they're coming back. Here we go, huh? All right. Live their full life.
All right, good evening, everyone. Glad to have you back as we continue our study. I think Mark on Sundays and I are going to compete from here on out to decide who's going to finish first and who's going to stay ahead of who. But we're going to start this evening with a question. Oftentimes I give you a question for your table, or if you're sitting at a table by yourself, for yourself to ponder. This one's a little bit, I've not asked the question in this way before, so if it's confusing, it's my fault. I've not tested it on students before you. But here's the question. What teachings or stories about Jesus, okay, so get the first part of the question. What teachings or stories about Jesus are so important that if you don't understand that teaching or that story, you will not understand Jesus? See what I'm asking? What teachings or what stories about Jesus are so important to the core of his identity or his ministry that if you don't understand that teaching or that ministry, or that event, you will not understand who he is or what he came to do? That's your conversation question as we get going. It's kind of a higher level thought process, but go. More than like, what's your favorite food? Okay. Okay, good. So you guys could probably talk about this particular question all the time, but let's just name the story. What's a story or what's a teaching where you would say, if you don't know that story or don't understand that story, you can't fully comprehend who Jesus is or what he came to do? What are some stories? What are some teachings? This is where y'all are quiet now, and I'm like, yeah, thanks. Y'all just talked a whole lot. Yeah. Oh, okay. So even I would just broaden out money. Jesus is teaching about money? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. We're going to come back to that's our text for tonight. So good answer. You get an A. All right. But yes, Jesus is washing feet. Now, here's the tricky part of that, though. Like I thought that tonight coming in as I was framing up the question, and then I'm like, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't tell that story, which is intriguing. But also through Jesus' teaching, the idea of Jesus washing feet, or the concept of reversal, of becoming, even though you're great, becoming less and serving. Boy, that's all the way through Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so this idea of someone who is great taking on the form of someone who is going to be humbled or less in order to serve is definitely a core concept that if you don't get that, you don't get Jesus. Okay, great. Other things you would point out? Other ones? Y'all always are talkative at your table. Yeah, Jim? Yeah.
All of the 7 I am statements.
Okay, good. Yeah, some of his identity statements would be core teachings. And we could probably go different places. We could go to the cross, right? You would recognize that if you don't understand the fact that Jesus was crucified and why, and not necessarily the full picture, but at least the basics of that, you might not fully comprehend or understand Jesus. The resurrection would be one of those. And we're going to come back and circle back to the resurrection and ask some questions. In fact, I'm being asked to speak at a local business leaders event for Christian business leaders on how the resurrection transforms just even our workplace, like the way that we work. Like if you don't understand the resurrection, you don't understand a lot of things about how Jesus calls you to live. And so we want to understand some things. And so I'm coming back to the washing feet. This is our passage today in John 13. This passage is near and dear to my heart, but I want to say this. It's easy to read through this story and say, oh, I understand it, and yet still not get it. You ever feel this way? Like, if you have kids where you're like, hey, here's the instructions. Like, you need to do the dishes before you leave the house tonight to come to church. And then they drive away and they leave. And then the dishes are still there. You're like, you understood it, but you did not understand it, right? You understand what I'm saying? So I want us to hear that tension a bit tonight as we study through this, that Jesus is going to set an example for us that then we're called to live out. I said this passage is fairly personal. I'm going to tell you a cheesy story. It's a bit embarrassing, but here it is. When I was 21 years old and had been dating a girl for 3 years, I decided it was time to pop the question and had to ask the question. This is before Instagram and before, hashtags and secret photographers and things like that. So I still had to come up with like the way that I wanted to do this. And this is actually the passage that framed that up. And so long story short, I ended up washing my, girlfriend / now fiance. Well, she didn't say yes for a bit, but fiance's feet to ask her the question, will you marry me? Can I serve you in this relationship? And, she hyperventilated, didn't say yes. I'm like, I'm assuming that's a yes, but okay, we're good. Now here's the thing. It was easy for me, relatively speaking, to do that. We've been married since 2002. Do you know what's not been easy to do? Is to wash her feet every single day as a part of that covenantal relationship when it comes to actually the heart of service. So it's one thing for us to understand that we're called to wash people's feet and that we're called to live like Jesus. It's a whole other thing than to embody the service mentality that Jesus has in our relationships and in our responsibilities and in our world. So we want to be challenged by that today. Can I give you one example? Then we'll move into the text. So my wife and I are arguing in a kitchen. I know. I'm not supposed to argue with my wife. I get it. And now you guys are going to think, oh, he's human. Yes. And so there's a dynamic where we're arguing in the kitchen. And I'm thinking, I'm going to win this argument. Like, I know I'm going to win this argument. I know all the evidence and I know all the facts. I'm going to win this argument. And so all of these thoughts are cycling through. Now, I don't know if, cognitive behavioral therapists would talk about thought loops, right? And that sometimes you need to interrupt that thought loop with like a truth statement. So somewhere in the midst of this thought statement of these arguments and then thinking poorly of my wife and honestly thinking I'm above, going to win in this argument, like the cross of Jesus kind of just interrupts that circuit. We had a breaker blow this morning, right? The breaker blew, stopped the circuit. Sometimes the cross of Jesus or stories like this need to pop in to that circuit that's just the worldly way of doing things and thinking and treating other people and pop the breaker and go, that's not how Christ followers actually live. And start a new circle, start a new cycle. Boy, it's different when I'm thinking, how can I serve my wife tonight? How can I serve my wife today? What does it look like to serve my kids today? Another story that's a short example. I was getting ready to go on a run. I run at lunchtime. This particular day, my high school daughter calls me. I'm literally 3 blocks away
All my running clothes are on. I'm just like far enough away to where I probably couldn't just put my office clothes back on. I sweat really bad. And so like I'm already going to need a shower. And my daughter calls me and says, hey, I forgot stuff at school. Can you bring me stuff at school? Well, it's now going to throw my whole schedule off. And I just remember being like, oh, I got off the phone and grumbling like Israel in the desert, right? And all of a sudden, same kind of thing. Thought cycle, right? And Jesus sometimes interrupts our thought cycle. Jesus is going to talk about this story as his example for how we are called to love other people. And what I'd love for you to imagine is that this story for you is not just a story that you look at, but it's a story that you then like get into and almost like a flight simulator, you get around and fly around for a little bit. And this is the powerful thing about stories. Because once you are in the story and living in the story, whether you're Peter or whether you're Jesus or whether you're Judas in the story, you mentioned Judas, all of a sudden you come to key moments in life to where you realize I'm in a moment where I get the chance to live out this Jesus story. Right? I get the chance to wash my wife's feet, not just as a kind of romantic gesture to say I'm going to, be your husband for the rest of your life and serve you, but as like just a gritty, mundane part of life. And what I want you to hear is not only this story, but stories like the Good Samaritan, those flight simulators, those stories, those teachings of Jesus. The more you are around them and listen to them and live in them, the more they will live and abide in you. We'll get to that next week. And the more you will start to bear that kind of fruit. So what we want to do tonight is not only examine the history of this story and the background of this story, the meaning of this story, but we really want to ask the question, so how do we live out this story? And I know Mark has preached on this. He did a great job preaching on this. So we'll try to talk along with him and also pull out some other details. So let's turn to John chapter 13, starting in verse 1. John starts out, he says this. He says, now before the feast of the Passover. So now we need to pause. Don't you hate when I do this? Okay. A bit of review and a bit of preview. Okay. So review. First thing I want to review is we have gone halfway through the Gospel of John. We ended the first section with the resurrection of Lazarus and the fact that they wanted to kill Lazarus and Jesus. And then at the beginning of the second section, chapter 12, we're here on Sunday. Chapter 12, verse 12, this is where we were last week. And Jesus entered into Jerusalem. Okay? So if you are getting ready, it's still out in the future. Feels like Easter should have come and gone already. Right? I'm ready for summer. But if you're getting ready for Passion Week, Easter week, this might be a helpful thing for you to write down on your sheet if you're not familiar with this. What happened each day of Holy Week? Okay? So let me back up one day. Chapter 12, verse 1, Saturday. Mary of Bethany washes Jesus' feet. Okay, so Mary washes Jesus' feet Saturday, right? The week before Passion Week. So that's a review. Number 2, Sunday. We call it Palm Sunday. We also talked about this passage last week, chapter 12, verse 12 in John. On Palm Sunday, Jesus, like a king who is going to have a coronation, be welcomed by the city. Jesus rides into town on a donkey. There are people celebrating him, waving the palm branches that are political symbols. They're singing the songs that would be politically charged songs. And the Jewish leaders, those in charge especially of the temple, they're angered by this. This is a week away. Notice how much tension is going to build as we go through this week. Can I pause and say, have you ever had a really long week filled with lots of emotion and lots of activity? You ever had one of those weeks where it just feels like it's in slow motion? I think that's this. Some of you are like, yeah, that's this week. Thanks a lot. A week after spring break with kids. I think this week for the disciples was that way. Now, one of the things I need you to see, since we just opened up John 13, John actually skips 3 days. The synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, tells us what happens on these 3 days. So I'm going to give you these events just so you're aware of what took place. Monday, Jesus went back into Jerusalem. So Sunday, already politically charged. He rides in like a king. He goes back outside of town. He comes back in on Monday. Monday's when he cleanses the temple. And my view is that he does this the second time. The first time was at the beginning of his ministry, and John records that particular incident. Some scholars would disagree and say John just put it chronologically somewhere else. There's enough differences
And it makes a whole lot of sense to me that this looks like a prophet that Jesus cleanses the temple. It's a symbol. It's an act that's a sermon, right? So if I walked in on Sunday morning and I started overturning the cafe tables, you all would know that I'm kind of upset that we have coffee at this church. I'm not, by the way. Right? But you all would know what the symbol represents. If I took a sign out to 7th Street and stood up with a flag and a sign on 7th Street, pretty quickly you would know what the symbolism of that moment was. Jesus cleansing the temple has a lot of Old Testament echoes and also a lot of kingly imagery. Guess who cleansed the temple from ungodly things? Kings did. Godly kings did that. Josiah, remember the 8-year-old king who grew up? He cleansed the temple. Hezekiah cleansed the temple, right? So these are things that godly kings do. It's also what the Maccabees, remember the palm branches? That's a symbol from 167 BC, 160 years earlier. That's what the Maccabees did when the Greeks overthrew the temple. And if I just lost you, that's fine. All I need you to see is when Jesus cleanses the temple and does that on Monday, he's acting like a prophet and a king, and they would have seen him making a statement through that. It's not just someone who doesn't like the money changers. It is that, but it's way more than that. That's Monday. Can you imagine now, every time Jesus comes into town, how much tension there's going to be? Right? All you need to be is someone who causes a little bit of trouble that all of a sudden security around here, they'll pay attention to you, right? Like that's all that matters. And they should. So this is happening Tuesday, bleeding into Wednesday. We're a little bit unsure of what happens that bleeds into Wednesday, but Tuesday into Wednesday is when Jesus gives some of his teaching that is looking ahead to 70 AD when the temple's going to be destroyed. And he'll say things like this: "Woe to you, teachers of the law! Woe to you, Pharisees!" He'll say things like this, that one day you're going to see this city surrounded. And he'll use imagery like the sun turned, dark and the moon turned to blood. So that happens Tuesday into Wednesday, that teaching that we would oftentimes call the Olivet Discourse or the Olivet Teaching. Okay, that's happening those 2 days. But again, if you're the leaders in Jerusalem, you know that that's against you. He also curses a fig tree in here, and that's a whole other thing because fig trees are symbols for Israel. And so we're like, cursed a fig tree. He's mean to a fig tree because it didn't have figs when it's not supposed to have figs? What's the deal? And he's like, it's a symbol because fig trees were another national symbol for Israel, as well as vines. We'll talk about that next week. So that then leads us to where we are. There's been a lot of things that have happened. Can you imagine how exhausted the disciples are at this point? And they're ready for a quiet evening. Now, we're going to get ready to celebrate Passover Thursday, but it's going to be a long night, right? This starts at sundown, and we're going to be up the entire night. I don't know when the last time you pulled an all-nighter was. So I don't know, like some of you are like, last week. I don't know when I've only pulled one all-nighter in my life as a student, maybe a couple as a parent, driving, different things like that. But they're terrible, right? Emotionally, physically. We're going to see some of that play out over the next couple days. But Thursday into Friday, you all know what happens Good Friday, right? Saturday, kind of let's call it a day of darkness, maybe a day of doubt, a day of questioning. You ever wondered between the cross of Jesus and the suffering that you're going through, and when your resurrection hasn't yet happened yet, like where is Jesus and what's going to happen? Like sometimes we live in the Saturday moments, waiting for Jesus to make things right. And then of course we get to Sunday, and this is my symbol I oftentimes draw for the empty tomb. So I want you to see in context where we are, because we had the first week of Jesus' ministry in John's gospel that led up to a wedding, and John is giving us some of the days of this final week that's going to be mapped out. So we're on Thursday evening, going back to John chapter 13, verse 1. This Passover feast then, looking at your handout, was an 8-day festival, but here's the thing. This festival started here, but travelers, pilgrims, coming from all over not just what we would call Israel, but kind of the Roman world, would come in for three. Jewish males were, in the Old Testament, called to come in for three festivals. Passover is one of them, in case you want to know. The other one's Pentecost. The other one's Feast of Tabernacles. Okay, so Pentecost, the most popular one, because it's spring, you can get in, and Book of Acts talks about Pentecost. A lot of people there to witness the birth of the church. But this entire week, travelers would be coming into town, and they would be purifying themselves in mikveh baths and going through the process of buying their sacrifices and getting everything in order, checking into their Airbnb. Can I just put it that way? Okay. Checking into the reserved spaces or their family space. We're going to see Jesus and the disciples do that. It's a prearranged space. Whether it's family or free or Airbnb, I don't know. But, Jesus has two of the disciples log into their app and they check it in and they go check into the Airbnb and now they're going to move in. Okay. So they've been coming into town. It's crowded now. But this feast starts that Thursday and goes throughout the rest of the week. This Thursday into Friday is technically Passover. This becomes the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We mentioned this a few weeks ago. Like Thanksgiving for us, we kind of go, well, Thanksgiving's a day, but it's also kind of like half a week for us, right? For many of you, you get off on Wednesday through Friday that week, and you're like, well, that's all Thanksgiving. And you might have a meal on Wednesday, and you might have another one on Thursday, and if you're like my family, there's another one on Friday, and you have leftovers on Saturday. So Thanksgiving food even is kind of all week that week. There are possibilities here that Jesus and his disciples are eating at a different time than the popular time. We don't know all of those details, but I just want us to notice that some of those things are playing out. So when it comes to the actual then process and foods being served, a lot of times you'll see individuals, churches even, practice Passover meals, right? They'll put together Passover meals and you'll have recipes and those things. A lot of those details are pulled out of what was later formalized by Jewish rabbis. I put the Hebrew word here, the Haggadah, and it would have been formalized into what we would call like a liturgy or like a formalization of how to celebrate the holiday or a worship service. But we can kind of project that some of those things would have still been true 120 years earlier when Jesus was doing it. Now, here's the danger of that is, do we practice Thanksgiving today the same way we did 100 years ago? And the answer is yeah, right? That's the answer. And the same thing, like 4th of July, is it the same thing today that it'll be 100 years from now? I don't know that. But we can kind of recognize that we may not know every single detail of the traditions in this particular moment of time, 30 or 33 AD, compared to some of those that the Jewish rabbis later formalized around 100 or so AD. But we can kind of point at it and go, oh, this is interesting. In fact, Luke's gospel mentions 2 cups of wine. The rabbis later actually mentioned 4 cups of wine and told what each of those cups represented. We can kind of go, oh, that's interesting. Like, what if that tradition traces all the way back to Jesus' generation, and Jesus is quoting the book of Exodus, why? That's what the holiday celebrates, and he's reading lines of the Exodus, like they would later, as he drinks one cup, and then later as another cup comes and is passed around, he's quoting. Here's the interesting thing. The 4th cup in that tradition was this idea of entering into the promised land, and Jesus says, I'll not yet drink that cup until I drink it with you, with my Father who is in heaven. So there's some evidence that some of those traditions would have been true. Here's what I need you to hear tonight. If I've lost you in some of the details, let me clarify through the fog this clear statement. Holidays shape family traditions or family, can I just say, legacy, right? Holidays do this. So the way we practice Christmas shapes our family. It just does. I think you've probably heard this story before. It's a cheesy old preacher story. There was a family who, every time they made a ham for Christmas, the ladies would cut both ends off of the ham. How many of you have heard this story before? I hope some of you had. Okay, because it's like a really cheesy old story, right? And so, generations go by, and they're still cutting the ends off the ham. And then finally, a daughter asks mom, hey, mom, why do we cut the ends off of the ham when we cook this ham for Christmas, Thanksgiving, whatever the story is? And the answer was, I don't know, let's ask grandma. By the time you get to grandma and great-grandma, you realize, oh, my pan was too small for the ham, so I had to cut the ends off of the ham, right? And so you are like, you're grown. Those are cheesy preacher jokes. But here's the thing. This festival, this holy day, was not just a retelling of the Exodus story, leaving Egypt, going into the wilderness, being saved out of slavery, and going into the promised land. There's not only a retelling of that, it was a reenactment of that. Some of you participated in Civil War reenactments, right? Reenactment, where you become part of the story. So little kids would grow up, and they would participate in this story with the father or whoever was the head of the table. And I need you to see that Jesus is doing this, but he's going to make the entire festival story about him. Now, you only do that if you're like God. And so there's some things about this story where I want you to understand the disciples would have been living out their childhood at the same time. This is all completely going to be re-wrapped around the identity of Jesus. And so that's intriguing to me as we play this out. Some things about this as well. Notice John doesn't actually get into the details of the meal. The synoptics already did. They were already written by the time John wrote. So he doesn't need to tell the details about the bread or the wine. He would say, hey, they told that. Let me tell you something they didn't talk about. So he doesn't deal with those. He did talk about Jesus being the bread of life back in John 6, if you remember. So that would be true. Let's talk briefly through a few verses. Then I'm going to pause with that upper room language there in your handout. Let's go ahead and read a few verses. Before the Passover feast, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart the world to the Father. This is the second time John says his hour had come. Every time up until this point, he had said what? My hour is not yet come. My hour is not yet come. The clock slows down as soon as Jesus says, my hour has now come. I'm departing. And then this phrase, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the very end. How do we see the love of Jesus? I think we would probably put two words on it. The servant heart of Jesus, or the service of Jesus, and the sacrifice of Jesus. I'm going to come back to those two words multiple times tonight because of that opening challenge that I had for you. It's one thing to understand this story. It's another thing to embody this story. So how do you embody the sacrificial love and the servant love of Jesus? Notice what happens next. During the supper, the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray Jesus. Now, we'll come back to Judas in a minute. But notice that Satan is at this table as well. Does Satan ever attend your family events? Okay, just checking. All right, verse 3. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God, he rose from the supper, laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, he tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and wipe them with a towel wrapped around him. A couple things that I think are interesting. Scholars point to the fact that this story in many ways looks like Jesus' entire life and ministry, doesn't it? Think about it. He's sitting at the head of the table. The way that oftentimes ancient tables from the Greek culture were arranged, you'll kind of see them, and this is top view, bird's eye view looking down. This would be called a triclinium. Now, sometimes this was couches, sometimes this would be more like, almost like what we would see as like medical cots. They were kind of that shape, kind of medical cots like lifted up. You kind of see them like laying beside each other, and there would be food oftentimes either here or the food would be put on the table. But the idea was that this is a communal meal. Now, we had friends from Afghanistan, and we did this on the floor around a blanket, right? Lounged around a blanket on the floor. So I don't know exactly the nature of this, but this meal is there. Jesus gets up from the head of the table. Now, traditionally, of course, this is the head of the table, and he gets up and he leaves this position of the master of the banquet. And he goes to the position, right, where the servant typically would serve from. And if you're not able to see this, I'm a visual learner, so sorry if I need to depict this way. Does this look like the ministry of Jesus, who leaves the throne of God, the position of the master, and takes on the role of a servant? Well, sure it is. That's Philippians 2:5-11 that Paul writes about. Right? Your attitude, he says, should be the same of that of Christ Jesus, your mindset, who being in the very nature of God, right, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped or held on to. I'm not going to stay here and hold on to this position. But instead,
right? He let go of it. He took on human nature. He took on the role of a servant, becoming made in human likeness. And he humbled himself, become a servant, even humbled himself to death, even, like we could say, death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place, that at the name of Jesus every knee would bow. Like, you understand that passage. And if you don't, well, that's the passage. After Jesus washed his feet, guess where he's going? Right back to the head of the table. This story is an embodiment of Jesus' entire ministry. It's one of the stories where I go, if you don't understand this story, I don't know that you fully comprehend Jesus' ministry or even how to be his disciple. And I would go back to, well, why don't Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell it? They do, just in different ways. Luke tells a story about, hey, if you go to a banquet, and when you go to the banquet, don't take this seat right next to the master. Take this seat at the end of the table. Take the lowest seat, notice, by the servants. And the master might move you up, sure, that's great, but take the lowest because the least will become the greatest. And Mark would say it this way, I did not come to be served, but to serve, to give my life as a ransom for many. Right? If you want to be great, you become a servant. So this story, in many ways, is kind of that culminating picture. Questions about that? I think that's really important for us to understand. Questions about that or observations about that? Okay, yeah, good.
I was also thinking about all of them entering the room and noticing
Yes.
that there's no servant there to do.
Yeah.
There should be a servant there to do, and every single one of them says, well, that's probably not my job.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and oftentimes we ask the question, like, why wasn't the servant there? It's an error. They're renting it, borrowing it. Can I maybe tag on that? Then something in your notes, it's later. This is how I actually love to teach, is not following my handout. But one of the things that's interesting is the question, I guess it is next, whose upper room is this? The answer is, I don't know for sure. But can I give you a reconstruction where I think we can make a pretty strong case that this is whose upper room it is. I think it belongs to the family of John Mark. Here's the reason why. I've given you two references in your handout. This is the upper, if it is, it's the same upper room that they use in the book of Acts, where the disciples are hiding after the crucifixion, the resurrection, and previous to, and as well post to Pentecost when the Holy Spirit comes. Acts tells us that belongs to the family of John Mark. Mark's gospel, that also talks about this upper room, tells another little story. When Jesus is arrested later on this night, and he's out in the garden, there's like this young guy, this teenage guy, I don't know, early 20s guy, who's like mysteriously out in the woods with them, out in the garden with them, and then when he gets caught, he leaves his garment behind and he runs away naked into the woods, and you're just like, I don't know, who is this guy? And scholars, I would tend to agree with them, have a conjecture that this might be John Mark, who the soldiers, if Judas left the upper room, can I just put this together? Judas left the upper room. Where'd he go? To go get the soldiers, to go get the entourage to come and arrest Jesus. Where would they have returned to? Makes sense. You go to the place where he was, knock on the door, he's not here. They charge in, I don't know, he's not here. Oh, we know where he's at, because this is where they've spent the night every night, out in the Garden of Gethsemane, a private garden. There's a cave out there. Some scholars, some archaeologists would suggest that maybe they spent the night in the cave in this private garden. That makes sense. And so they, Airbnb'd a garden, but Jews, I know where he's at. This is, previous to the days of like video cameras on every street corner. And so they go out there, but Mark, that's his upper room, Mark's like, what's going to happen? And he, like a teenager would, right? Someone in the early 20s, he storm chases, right? He runs after those, and then he's caught in the midst of this chaos. I think that's a highly likely scenario. I don't know for sure. My faith doesn't rest on it. But if this upper room is there, one of the things, I still have the question of why is no one there to wash feet? That wouldn't always happen, but someone would take that position of the servant. Nobody does. So Jesus does. That's good. The other thing we're going to see is, I teased about the fact that Satan's attending this banquet and about him attending your family holidays too. Sorry. You know this dynamic when it comes to this particular passage. This is a bit mysterious. We're going to see a couple things. Satan is going to have influence over, he's going to put this into Judas's heart. This is what Satan does. So can I pause here
and ask you, I think Satan has three major tactics. You need to know your enemy, right? Whether you're in sports, I'm talking to FCA Banquet Friday night. Night of Champions is the night out of the book of John, which is handy. But we're going to be talking about the enemy's tactics and how to understand your enemy so that you can have victory. Overcome is the word. Overcome your enemy. So can I ask you, maybe this is a good table question. Satan, throughout Scripture, has three main ways he attacks people. What are those three ways? Your answers might be different than mine, but have that conversation. Go. Now I need to know what that comment was.
Just enough, be believable, he's just believable enough.
All right. So these would be the words. I would put four, maybe for our purposes, on the board. Okay? And we can talk about demon possession in just a bit. In fact, I'm going to add that word here. Okay, so I'm going to add five. I'm going to have 5 words. Okay. Number 1, deception. He's the father of lies. Agree? Okay. I'm going to come back to this here in just a second. Okay. Accusation. He can accuse you because you've sinned. He's an accuser. That's actually what his name means. Satan and devil, accuser and enemy. Kind of the root of those two words. Okay. Accusation. He accuses you. And then third in our list so far, even though I'm out of order, death. By the time we get to this story, can I ask you, which of these tools for a believer, a disciple of Jesus, does Jesus render ineffective? Well, death, accusation, deception? No. I mean, he gives us the truth, and the truth will set you free, but we're still susceptible to that, aren't we? Okay. I'm going to maybe cross off possession. I'm going to come back to this right now. So when I teach the Gospels to students in college, one of the things that I talk about when it comes to Satan's influence is that often what we find is kind of 3 things. Either deception, that's kind of a speaking lies, and it's kind of like out there, and recognize this is somewhat metaphysical. So I'm doing the best I can to put this in physical human terms. But he can speak lies, which is kind of outside of us speaking lies into us. We got to decide, do we let this in? And do we let the airplanes of lies land? That's from church camp, right? I was teaching junior hires about the lies of Satan. Had a teacher fold paper airplanes and throw them at the kid's head, right? And unfortunately, like, we believe a lot of lies, and Satan throws a lot of airplanes of lies. But you can eventually, like, not let those airplanes land, right? You can be those thought loops. You can say, I'm not letting that airplane land. And so you can have the truth, but he still speaks truth. The second would be oppression. By this, I'm going to talk about physical oppression. This might be a sickness, right? We see people who are demonically impacted and have a physical ailment. This is mysterious to us because and I speak collectively, in modern European Western culture, oftentimes we don't believe in the supernatural, right? So we don't have room for physical things to be caused by spiritual things. Although I do find it interesting, psychosomatic ailments, our mind having impact on our physical body, is something we go, oh yeah, that's a thing. So why not spiritual, physical? We're holistic people. I do see this. Does that mean all sicknesses are demonically caused? Frank Peretti books, if you read those in the 1990s. No, I'm not saying that, by the way. I'm saying sometimes this is the case. And then there's possession, where Satan, specifically demons on behalf of Satan, are able to come in and are allowed to take control or take control over an individual. My question for our relevancy today is this. Which of these is going on with Judas? And it might be a range
right? I don't know that I would put oppression there, but deception and a hardening of heart, I don't know that it ever gets to this. In fact, I don't seem to see that in the text. What I do see, we're at Passover. We're celebrating the Exodus. The story is in the air of Moses and the 10 plagues and the blood that's on the doorposts and the leaving of Egypt. And there's another character in the story, and his name is Pharaoh. And one of the things about the story of Egypt, about Pharaoh, was this. You remember how it says Pharaoh hardened his heart? And then it'll turn around and say, and God hardened his heart. And then it'll say, and Pharaoh hardened his heart. And God hardened his heart. My question is, like, which is it? And the answer is yes. Like, God is allowing Pharaoh to do, God's a gentleman. He's not going to force his way, in on your life. So Pharaoh's hardened his heart, and God is, these plagues are allowing Pharaoh. So here's what I want to say. When you encounter Jesus, he's not going to let you stay neutral. This is probably the way I'd summarize it. Pastorally. If I'm meeting with you across the table, I'm probably going to summarize it this way. Jesus is not going to let you stay neutral. You decide whether you let him in, he'll soften your heart. If you say no thank you, he'll test you, and you might decide to harden your heart. The same difficulty, plague in Egypt, might soften you to repent, or might harden you to say, I want nothing to do with you, Jesus. And I think something's happening in Judas's heart and in Judas's mind and in Judas's life that is leading him from this deception. So can I pause for a second and ask this question at your table? What do we know about Judas that could cause us to say, here's why Judas did what he did? Does that make sense what I'm asking? Why did Judas do what he did? And that's my question at your table. Why did Judas do what he did? Go. All right. I don't know if you've watched The Chosen. I don't know if you've kept up with it. I don't even know if they're on like chapter 5 or chapter 7 or what they are on. But there are some, I would say, apocryphal. That's a great way of saying like urban legends. Urban legends about Judas, of what might have caused it, some conjecture. So that's fine. We can have that in this moment. I do want to kind of sift through like what's conjecture and what evidence do we have in the text, and just build the best scenario that we can of what motivated Judas. Now, can I just like add to the board? Satan, like John just says, like, hey, Satan deceived at the very least Judas's heart, and Judas said yes. He let the paper airplane land, and he acted on it, and Satan is going to be a participant in this. By the way, when you follow Jesus, the Holy Spirit participates in you living like Jesus, so you get your choice. You're always following the truth or a lie. You just get a choice of who you're listening to. So you only get one or two, and it's never neutral. So Satan's one. Can I come up with a couple more? What are a couple more from the text or from just the way people talk about Judas? What are some things that may have caused him to do this? Yeah. Yeah. Good. In the Synoptics, it's a little bit in John as well. In the Synoptics, it becomes pretty clear that there's something, well, John does this. He's the keeper of the money bag, right? He's the keeper of the money bag. That there's something about Judas's heart that is motivated by money. Now, scholars, and I would sometimes even question this, but he only got 30 pieces of silver, like the price of a servant slave. It doesn't seem like it's a fair trade. But have you ever made a bad trade just because your heart was in the wrong spot? Have you ever had buyer's remorse? Okay, Judas sure does. So these two things are the clearest from the text motivation we have. In fact, why do the synoptic, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Gospels
tell the story of Judas and Mary of Bethany and her washing feet and the disciples getting mad, specifically Judas, and saying, why the waste? Well, the reason why they do is they put this story next to Judas to show his heart. And John's like, it actually took place on Saturday, but they're telling it there to compare and contrast. She's giving up money. He wants more money. So there's that in his heart. There's also one more theory. This would be the one that I would put a question mark on, and that is this, that there's a theory out there. I think the New Chosen episode has this as their plot line for Judas, is that he wanted to force Jesus' hand to become the political Messiah that he wanted him to be. Is that how they are going to move that? Okay, that becomes a theory. Now, there's not a lot of evidence in the text for that motivation, but can I give you some reconstruction that goes, okay, maybe. Okay, the one is a pretty far reach. Here's one of them. Judas's name. Imagine mom, name and son. I don't know, we got to come up with a name. What's a good Jewish name? Well, I know. There's a warrior, Maccabean period, Judas Maccabeus, right? Freed the people, right? Messianic name, right? Judas, tribe of Judah. Jude, right? This is where Jerusalem's at, Judea. Okay, so it's a family name. The book of Jude, Jesus' brother named Judas, which is kind of awkward. So we have other Judes or Judases that are named. So it's kind of an interesting name, and I don't know, maybe he grew up in this milieu of where they're wanting to overthrow the Romans. I don't know. Little boys growing up with toy soldiers, and they're like, for me growing up, it was Americans versus the Russians because I grew up in the early 80s. So there's that. So I don't know, maybe he grew up with some of those, but Jesus comes and he has expectations for Jesus. What about your kingdom, Jesus? Now, do the disciples have expectations for a physical kingdom? Yeah, they do. Even all the way to the book of Acts, even after the resurrection, they're like, is this the time when you're going to restore your kingdom? Like the borders, like we expect, and overthrowing the Romans. So some would argue that when Judas does this, he's putting Jesus in a position where he's in front of the Roman governor and in front of the kind of the powers of Rome, and it's going to force his hand and his timing to come out and start the revolt, to start the war against Rome. And I look at that and I go, maybe. But I do want to land here and go, boy, that's enough to cause people to do really stupid things, first of all, but also things against Christ, right? The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. So Judas is an intriguing character. The spiritual temptation of this, the lies that are wrapped up in this, you might go in the story of could I actually miss Jesus and what he's doing because of just buying into some of the lies of the world? And the answer is yeah. Sometimes the world looks flashier than washing feet. Can I just put it that way? Okay, so you want to follow Jesus? Okay, he's calling you to die on a cross. Judas is maybe I'm good. Just about money, it sounds good. So that tension is there as we play this out. When it comes to Jesus' experience of Judas, I want you to hear this. Jesus' family, I drew a crown. That's what this is, in case you were wondering what I drew. King David knew betrayal. He had a son who stood outside of the city and said, if I were the king, not my dad, if you'd follow me, and raised up an army against him, betrayed him. And David had to flee the town over the Mount of Olives, right outside of town, where Jesus is spending the night, where Judas is going to come out and kiss Jesus. David, the king, had to flee from his betrayer over that mountain. The same place where Judas is going to kiss him. Could you just hear all of the echoes of history and betrayal that are happening in that spot? And there's going to be people throwing things and, cursing David and mocking David on the way out of town. So the king knows betrayal. Jesus knows betrayal. But this is a family meal. And I drew the picture of the table. Mark alluded to this. We don't know exactly where everyone is seated. There are some traditions based upon conjecture. But if Jesus is here, it does look like Judas and the disciple whom Jesus loved, I think he's John, the book of John, that Judas and John are sitting to the right and left of Jesus in the prime two seats. And Peter seems to be sitting off over here where he has to kind of ask John, hey, so what did they say up there? I think that's kind of funny that Peter didn't get a good seat. Luke 22 tells us that somewhere in the middle of this meal, the disciples started arguing over who was the greatest. Now, I think
It's after Jesus washed feet. That's terrible. Jesus gets from the table and goes, hey, this is what it means to be a disciple of mine. He goes over and he becomes the servant of everybody. He gets back to the table. He goes back to the master's seat. And somewhere, it's chaotic. It's a meal. There's plenty of people in the room. Somewhere in that moment, they start arguing about who's the greatest. And I'm just like, I can't. But this is the third time they've done that. The second time, James and John and their mommy comes up. And it's right after Jesus' third prediction of his death. I'm going to the cross. I'm going to be mocked and flogged and killed. And James and John come up and go, hey, can we have the good seats to your right and left? Mom comes up because their honor is actually benefits her too, financially, as well as with honor. It's right after Jesus said, I'm going to the cross. I just taught that text this morning. And I asked my students, does that ever bother you that that's humanly possible for the disciples of Jesus? To have a moment where they fight over greatness right after Jesus gives us the most powerful teaching we could ever have about what it really means to live and love like him with service and sacrifice. And boy, this is how God usually ordains it, right? Like this morning with my family, getting ready for school was kind of crazy, not as great. And it's spring break week. It's Wednesday now. We've had to get up several days in a row, and there's a little bit of arguing at our family table. And I just had to laugh because here I am going in to teach on this dynamic of Jesus saying, "Hey, this isn't working in the world. When you live the way of the world, it doesn't work in your family. It doesn't work in the church. It doesn't work in your workplace. It doesn't work in society. It doesn't work on social media, right? But if you live like this, it actually transforms communities and families and lives and marriages and workplaces if you live like Jesus. If more leaders would live like Jesus, this transforms daily routines and daily habits and daily systems and the way that things play out. I want us to understand the depth of this particular moment as it plays out. Walking through the betrayal bullet points if you're curious where I'm at. John tells us in chapter 13, verse 30, that it was night. Now, it's interesting to me because darkness and light in John's gospel is really important. John 1, right, talks about the darkness pre-creation and light was creation, right? So light and darkness. Darkness is pre-God's created order, the chaos of the world without God and his spirit. And light is when God has put everything into order. And we recognize this tension, this dynamic. Philosophers, John, I think, is writing to them as well. Philosophers, both Jewish and Greek, use the same metaphor. So one of the questions we have when John alludes to details like this, and it was night, is he actually putting a scene over the story to go, yeah, it's spiritually a dark night? I think he does. I think he did the same thing with Nicodemus way back in John chapters 2 and 3. Remember how Nicodemus came to Jesus and it was night. Now Nicodemus seems to be coming into the light. Judas is going the opposite direction. So he walks out into the evening, walks out into the darkness. This betrayal, however, here's the Son of Man is glorified. This betrayal is going to backfire. You know this. Jesus is going to say the Son of Man is going to be lifted up. He said this before in John's Gospel. He alluded to that bronze snake. Remember Mark Christian? If you don't, it's okay. Mark Christian referring to that bronze snake that was lifted up in the wilderness. It's this Old Testament story, kind of a weird story. Israel got bit by snakes. How do you heal it? It's a curse. How do you heal it? Well, make a bronze snake, lift it up, and if you look at the bronze snake, you can be healed. And Jesus is like, I'm going to be lifted up like that. And if you are lifted up, you can be healed. Now, back of an ambulance, the cross with a snake, that's probably more Asclepius, like the Greek Roman god of healing, but it is intriguing how much those overlap, right? Which one came first? There's a lot of curiosities about that. So when it comes to this story, Jesus is going to say, hey, even though Judas, when he walks out, even though it looks like the enemy's going to win, this is going to lead to my glory. Notice he's not going to go to the servant's corner. He's going to go to the cross. But it's going to result in the cross is going to result in his exaltation. And so we will come to, not very much detail in John's gospel about it, we'll come to the ascension of Jesus, where Jesus ascends to the right hand of God. That is that lifted up as well. It's a both and. He's lifted up on the cross, and he's going to be lifted up physically in the ascension, and as well as, in that sense, by glory and honor. Let me talk about the cross for a minute, because Jesus uses this imagery. Cross is interesting. We're going to get into some more details, archaeology of the crucifixion. Oftentimes we picture the cross kind of this shape right here, correct? Oftentimes the sign the reason we put it there is it's posted above Jesus' head in the accounts. But you know this, crosses were of different shapes. Okay, so sometimes you'll see, especially older movies, I don't know, examples, but you'll see kind of a capital T-shaped cross. There's a Christmas story that shows the nativity, shows a victim being crucified just like in a tree. A couple things I need you to know about this. Crosses were not prefabbed at a factory somewhere. We just recognize that? Like wooden planks were not like prefabbed in a factory. This is pre-industrial revolution. So nails and crosses they didn't go to Lowe's and buy these. So it's kind of a tactic that you kind of use whatever materials you have available, sometimes on a wall. But the Romans also experimented with this. Can we think of like recent eras in history to where an occupational army experimented on human victims in order to torture them and find new ways of torturing them? Yeah, I mean, you don't have to go very far to go to Nazi Germany to see that. Well, I mean, there's probably more recent stories of that. Okay, so the way the victim was affixed to a cross was also, it varied. Sometimes they would nail the victim's feet to a platform, right? So your feet would be nailed down onto a wooden platform, and you would stand on that platform. Sometimes the victim's feet would be nailed with a nail going into the side of the cross on each side, and you would kind of straddle the cross. We have evidence of that as well. Sometimes, rather than being nailed up, by the way they would nail you, hands included your wrists in their language, the way that they referred to it. So oftentimes the nail, if you take your fingers and poke kind of between those two bones there's actually a nerve there that'll cause your hand to cramp up. Some of you maybe had like your mom or, I don't know, older brother pinch you right there. But it's also a hinge. You can hang weight on that. So we have evidence of bones and where they're worn because of crucifixion victims. And so nails would sometimes be driven through their hands in that way. Other times they would be, tied with ropes, and they would last longer that way. Although blood loss here, you could last quite a bit because it'd coagulate around that nail. Jesus is on the cross for a rather short amount of time compared to other victims. Sometimes people would last weeks, if not a month. And the way that they would die would actually be by exposure. So animals, bugs, sickness, gangrene, rather than, I think what happens with Jesus, we'll come back to this, is some sort of a heart issue, a pulmonary rupture. Scholars, medical scientists would come out with that conjecture, and I'll make sure I get that language right when we actually come to it. And so one of the things that I want us to see is that when Jesus says, I'm lifted up, this is a humbling picture, a picture of suffering. But here's the other thing I need you to see. Oftentimes when we picture crosses in movies, they're like lifted way up in the air, right? Like it's up on a hill and it's kind of way out and distant. The way the Romans actually like to do this is they like to put these, and I'm not putting this to scale, and they definitely don't have lines down the middle of the road, but they like to put this by the major highways, entrances and exits inside of outside of cities, major highways, Spartacus, right? And if you watch the old movie Spartacus, the crosses that are along the Roman road, they put them along the way. They're billboards. It's propaganda. What does the propaganda say? This is why I'm dealing with this right here. Here's what the propaganda says. The propaganda says this: if you lift yourself up above Rome, as like a Messiah figure, a rebel, a king, someone who's trying to overthrow Rome, if you want to lift yourself up, we'll lift you up. We even put a sign on there. It says, King of the Jews. But the propaganda is, this is what happens when you rise up against Rome, is we'll raise you up. And so these billboards would be a common fixture. The Romans were good at propaganda. Remember when Jesus came into town on Sunday? We called it a triumphal entry. The Romans had their own parades too, and they were filled with propaganda, right? The propaganda was this: you can't raise yourself up against Rome. So the parade, at the end of the parade, it wasn't Santa Claus, it was the general and the defeated army. Specifically, at the end, the general or whoever it was, the king they defeated, they would take it to, oftentimes to the temple, and then that's where that individual would either be mercifully set free, but most oftentimes executed by, it'd be kind of the final act of the war, be executed there by the general or the emperor. Ahead of them would be all of the armies, and they would be dressed as servants and slaves, but ahead of them would be billboards, speaking of billboards, that would reenact pictures, paintings would be painted on these billboards to reenact the different battles that took place. So you could retell the story, because it wasn't Vietnam yet, they didn't have it filmed. So you not only had that, but you had floats that actually had real human actors, the people who were the defeated armies, and the people who were the victors, and they would reenact battle scenes in these floats and in these sections of the parade and actually slaughter people right along the roads or reenact these different moments. Because here's what Rome wanted you to know. You don't raise yourself up against Rome. But Jesus is actually saying, I'm going to be lifted up, I'm going to be glorified. So when we come back, let me give you a preview for the next couple sessions. John is unique in that he's going to give us what I'm going to call an intimate farewell address with his disciples as they leave this upper room. Luke and Mark tells us that as they go, they sing a hymn. I don't know what hymn it is. It's probably one of the Psalms. Man, I could take a pick, right? Psalm 22 is going to be on the lips of Jesus eventually. My God, why have they forsaken me? You ever read the end of that psalm, though? But I'll tell your name among the nations. I know that you're there. It's a faith song. Like it's not just, it is a song of desperation, but it's also a song of faith. So Jesus is going to leave, he's going to worship. He's going to sing probably praise song, the Hillel Psalms, but they're going to leave. And then next week, John 14 through 17 is an entire farewell address. And this is what Jesus would say and pray over his disciples as he says goodbye. I don't know that you can understand Jesus' ministry if you don't, we could probably say this about a lot of things. If you don't get some of this. This may take us 2 weeks, John 14 through 17. But that puts us right in line then to come to the betrayal of Jesus, to the trials of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, and then Peter's reinstatement. So that's where we're going to be over the next few weeks, leading right up to Easter, a little bit beyond. April 21st, I think, is our last Wednesday night. I'll hang around for a little bit. If you have questions, let me pray for us, and we'll be done. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you so much for the opportunity we have to come and study your word. God, I thank you for the time, God, that my brothers and sisters here have invested. I pray that you will use me, definitely an imperfect person and vessel, but someone who I pray can be an encouragement, someone who can be perhaps a guide in understanding not only your word, but the heart of Jesus. So God, more than being filled with more information, I pray that we can be filled with more of your spirit. That in our marriages, in our relationships, in our friendships, at work, God, in our community, in our church, in our world, that we might live and love more like Jesus. Jesus said this, when you live like this, the world will know that you're my disciples. So help people see that we're disciples of Jesus because of the way we humble ourselves in service. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we'll see you next week. Thanks, friends.
Thank